The rifle shot cracked through the silence of Cedar Creek's Main Street, shattering the window of the general store as Grace Barkley ducked behind a water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't the first time she'd faced gunfire in this dusty Montana town, and at 22 years old she was beginning to wonder if it might be her last. "Get back inside, Miss Barkley," Sheriff Tanner shouted from behind the cover of a hitching post. "This ain't no place for a lady." Grace smoothed her worn calico dress and adjusted the small wire spectacles that had slipped down her nose. "With all due respect, Sheriff, nowhere in this town seems to be the place for me." The year was 1879, and Grace Barkley had earned herself quite the reputation in Cedar Creek, though not the kind most young women would desire. She wasn't known for scandals or loose morals, but rather for being the most consistently rejected woman in the entire Montana territory. As the gunfire ceased and the sheriff apprehended the drunken miner who decided to air his grievances with bullets, Grace gathered her parcels and continued down the street, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her like faithful shadows. "There she goes again," Mrs. Henderson murmured to Mrs. Collins as they stood outside the millinery shop. "Poor thing's been turned down by every eligible bachelor from here to Helena." "My Thomas said she talks too much about them books," Mrs. Collins replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "Says no man wants a wife who thinks she's smarter than him." Grace pretended not to hear, though each word stung like a needle. 7 proposals she had received in her life, and 7 times she had been jilted before reaching the altar. The reasons varied: her bookishness, her stubborn opinions, her plain features, or the fact that her late father had left nothing but debts when fever took him 3 years prior. Whatever the cause, the result remained the same. Grace Barkley, unwanted and increasingly desperate, she rounded the corner and nearly collided with Elijah Palmer, the banker's son, and her most recent failed courtship. "Miss Barkley," he stammered, tipping his hat awkwardly. "I trust you're well." "Quite well, Mr. Palmer," she replied coolly. "How is Miss Jenkins? I hear congratulations are in order." Elijah reddened. "Yes, well, these things happen rather quickly sometimes." He cleared his throat. "No hard feelings, I hope." Grace offered a tight smile. "None whatsoever." "I wish you both every happiness." She continued toward the schoolhouse where she taught, her steps quickening as tears threatened. Grace had loved teaching the children of Cedar Creek, finding purpose in their eager minds when her personal dreams of family repeatedly crumbled. But even this small joy was now in jeopardy. The school board had made it clear that her position was contingent on appropriate moral standing in the community. While being jilted wasn't immoral, the whispers had evolved into rumors that perhaps there was something fundamentally wrong with her, something that drove men away at the last moment. Such gossip was poison in a small town, especially for a schoolteacher. Inside the empty schoolhouse, Grace finally allowed her composure to crack. Sinking into her chair, she buried her face in her hands and wept quietly, her shoulders shaking with the effort to remain silent even in her despair. "I cannot stay here," she whispered to the empty room. "I simply cannot." That evening, she sat at her small kitchen table in the tiny house she'd managed to keep after her father's death. With shaking hands, she unfolded a letter that had arrived the previous day, a letter from her cousin Martha in the growing settlement of Willow Springs, 200 miles west. "Dearest Grace," the letter read, "I know things have been difficult since Uncle William's passing, and I've heard whispers of your troubles even here. Willow Springs is a new town with a desperate need for a schoolteacher. The position pays $30 a month, and you could board with us until you find suitable accommodation. Consider it, dear cousin. Sometimes a fresh start is the greatest blessing one can receive." Grace traced her finger over the words, "a fresh start." No one would know her history or the string of broken engagements. No one would whisper behind their hands as she passed. She could be simply Miss Barkley, the new schoolteacher, her past left behind in the dust of Cedar Creek. By dawn, her decision was made. She packed her meager belongings, her father's books, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the hand-stitched quilt her grandmother had made for her wedding day, a day that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. With her savings and the small sum from selling her father's house, she purchased passage on the westbound stagecoach. As Cedar Creek disappeared behind her, Grace pressed her forehead against the stagecoach window and exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. Whether Willow Springs held her future or just another disappointment remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, hope flickered in her chest like a stubborn flame. The journey was arduous. Spring rains had turned much of the trail to mud, slowing their progress and forcing unplanned stops. At one such delay, when a washed-out bridge required a lengthy detour, Grace found herself standing beside the stagecoach, stretching her legs and breathing in the scent of wet pine and earth. "Headed somewhere particular, madam?" asked a deep voice behind her. She turned to find a tall man leaning against a magnificent chestnut horse. He wasn't dressed like the other passengers, no city clothes or traveling suit. Instead, he wore practical buckskins, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes and a revolver strapped to his hip. "A cowboy or perhaps a scout." "Willow Springs," she replied, adjusting her spectacles. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher there," he nodded thoughtfully. "Rough country between here and there, spring's a tricky time to travel." "I had little choice in the timing," she said, more sharply than intended. The strain of the journey and the uncertainty ahead had frayed her nerves. To her surprise, he smiled, a warm, genuine expression that softened the weathered lines of his face. "Didn't mean no offense, madam, just making conversation." "I apologize," Grace said, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. "The journey has been challenging." "Name's Finn Westfield," he said, extending a hand. "I'm headed in that direction myself, ranch business." His hand engulfed hers, calloused and warm. "Grace Barkley," she replied, noting the strength in his grip and the directness of his gaze. His eyes, she realized, were a striking shade of blue, standing out against his sun-darkened skin. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Barkley," he said, releasing her hand. "If you don't mind some company, I'll ride alongside the coach for a spell. These roads can attract unsavory types." Before she could respond, the driver called for passengers to reboard. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Westfield." True to his word, Finn Westfield and his chestnut mount became companions to the stagecoach. When bandits appeared on the horizon the following day, they quickly disappeared upon seeing the armed rider flanking the coach. When a wheel broke on a particularly treacherous stretch of road, it was Finn who helped make repairs while keeping watch for danger. Each time the coach stopped, Grace found herself looking for the cowboy, and each time they exchanged a few more words. She learned he ran a small but growing cattle operation outside Willow Springs. He'd come east to purchase breeding stock and was returning home. He learned she was an avid reader who could recite Wordsworth from memory and had taught herself basic Latin from her father's old textbooks. On the third night, when they camped beside a small creek, Grace found herself sitting beside Finn near the fire after the other passengers had retired to their tents. "What brings a learned lady like yourself to a rough place like Willow Springs?" he asked, feeding a small stick into the flames. "Seems you'd be more at home in a city with libraries and such." Grace hesitated, unwilling to share her humiliations with this man she barely knew yet found increasingly easy to talk to. "A change of scenery," she said finally, "and my cousin Martha lives there with her husband." Finn nodded, not pressing further. "It's a good town, growing fast, needs civilizing influences like a proper school." He glanced at her. "The children will be lucky to have you." Something in his tone, simple sincerity without flattery or condescension, touched Grace deeply. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I hope I can make a difference there." "You will," he said with such certainty that she almost believed him. "Folks like you always do." The conversation shifted to safer topics, the stars overhead, the changing landscape as they moved west, his stories of cattle drives and the characters he'd met along the way. Grace found herself laughing for the first time in months at his tale of a city-bred cook who'd accidentally used a skunk cabbage in the trail stew. When she finally retired to her tent, Grace realized something startling. In all their conversations, Finn Westfield had truly looked at her, not through her or around her, as most men did. He'd listened to her opinions without dismissing them and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "He's simply being kind to a fellow traveler." Yet as sleep claimed her, Grace couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to be truly seen by someone like Finn Westfield. The stagecoach arrived in Willow Springs 5 days later, rolling down a main street that was little more than a wide dirt road lined with hastily constructed buildings. The frontier town hummed with activity, men hauling lumber for new construction, women hanging laundry on lines strung between buildings, children darting between wagons and horses. Grace stepped down from the coach, her legs stiff from the journey, and scanned the dusty street for her cousin. A plump woman with familiar features waved enthusiastically from in front of the general store. "Grace, over here." As Martha enveloped her in a tight embrace, Grace caught sight of Finn Westfield securing his horse to a hitching post several yards away. He tipped his hat to her with a small smile before turning to speak with a man outside what appeared to be a land office. "You must be exhausted," Martha was saying, taking one of Grace's bags. "James has the wagon ready. We'll get you settled at our place and you can rest before meeting the school trustees tomorrow." "The trustees? So soon?" Grace asked, her attention divided between her cousin and the tall cowboy now disappearing into the land office. "They're eager to meet you," Martha explained as they walked toward a wagon where a thin, pleasant-faced man waited. "The children have been without proper schooling for nearly 6 months now." That evening, over a simple but hearty meal in Martha and James's snug cabin on the edge of town, Grace learned more about her new home. Willow Springs had sprung up almost overnight following the discovery of silver in the nearby mountains. The initial rush had subsided, but the town remained, supported by ranching, timber, and its position as a supply point for smaller mining operations. "The school's not much to look at," James admitted, passing her a plate of biscuits. "But the town council just approved funds for proper desks and books. And housing for you," Martha added. "Nothing fancy, mind you, just a small cabin behind the schoolhouse. It's been used for storage, but James and some of the men have been fixing it up." Grace felt a surge of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you both for arranging all this." "Nonsense," Martha said, patting her hand. "Family helps family. Besides, it'll be nice having you nearby after all these years." As the conversation continued, Grace found her thoughts drifting to Finn Westfield. Would their paths cross again in this small town? The sudden interest she felt in a man she barely knew was unsettling. After so many disappointments, she'd sworn to focus on her teaching and forget the dream of marriage and family that had brought her nothing but heartache. The next morning, Grace met with the school trustees, the town mayor, the minister, and 2 prominent businessmen. They seemed pleased with her credentials and experience, and by noon, she was officially appointed as the teacher of Willow Springs with a salary of $30 per month plus housing. "School term starts next Monday," Mayor Hardwick informed her, a portly man with an impressive mustache. "That gives you the rest of the week to prepare the schoolhouse and review the materials. We've got about 20 children of school age in town, plus a few from outlying ranches who might attend when weather and chores permit." "I'll be ready, sir," Grace assured him, already mentally organizing lessons and schedules. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of town, a simple, single-room building with a small bell tower. Inside, she found rows of rough-hewn benches, a teacher's desk on a raised platform, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Shelves along one wall held a meager collection of books, many worn and outdated. Behind the schoolhouse, as promised, stood a tiny cabin little more than a single room with a small lean-to kitchen. Men were working on the roof, hammering new shingles into place. Grace recognized James among them and waved. "Should be finished by tomorrow," he called down. "Martha's bringing over some furnishings this afternoon." Grace spent the rest of the day cleaning the schoolhouse, scrubbing floors and windows layered with dust. As the afternoon waned, she stood on a chair, attempting to hang a map of the United States on the wall behind her desk. "Need a hand with that?" she startled at the voice, nearly losing her balance. Finn Westfield stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Westfield," she said, steadying herself, "you startled me." "Sorry about that," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "Saw you working as I passed by, thought you might need some help." Grace hesitated only briefly before handing him the map. "Thank you. It seems determined to hang crooked no matter what I do." Finn easily reached up and secured the map, his height making the task simple. "There you go, straight as an arrow." "I appreciate it," Grace said, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after hours of cleaning. She pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Are you settling back in after your journey?" he nodded, glancing around the schoolhouse with interest. "Getting there, had some business with the land office yesterday, expanding the ranch a bit." His eyes returned to her. "And you, finding Willow Springs to your liking?" "It seems a fine community," she replied. "Everyone has been most welcoming." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Finn cleared his throat. "Well, I should let you get back to your preparations. Just wanted to make sure you arrived safely." "That's very kind of you," Grace said, surprised by his thoughtfulness. He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's a town social on Saturday night. Welcome for the new teacher, I hear." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Might see you there." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Grace with the strange sensation that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't quite name what it was. The remainder of the week passed in a flurry of activity. Grace organized the schoolhouse, prepared lessons, and met many of her future pupils as they came by with their parents to introduce themselves. Martha helped her settle into the small cabin, which, despite its size, felt like a palace to Grace after years of struggling to maintain her father's house in Cedar Creek. Saturday evening arrived, and with it, the social at the town hall. Grace dressed with care in her best dress, a deep blue wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Martha had insisted on arranging her hair, pinning the thick brown locks into a softer style than Grace usually wore. "There," Martha said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look lovely, cousin." Grace examined her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who looked back seemed different, somehow still plain, with her serious eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, but perhaps not quite as severe as she had grown accustomed to seeing. The town hall buzzed with activity when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathered townspeople. A small band played in one corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. Grace found herself surrounded by curious residents, all eager to meet the new schoolteacher. As she circulated through the crowd, accepting welcomes and answering questions about her teaching methods, Grace kept finding her gaze drawn to the door. It wasn't until nearly an hour into the evening that Finn Westfield appeared. He'd exchanged his practical trail clothes for a clean shirt, dark vest, and what appeared to be relatively new denims. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, was revealed to be a rich brown with hints of copper when caught by the lamplight. Several people greeted him warmly as he entered, suggesting he was well regarded in the community. Grace quickly looked away when his eyes swept the room and landed on her. She focused intently on Mrs. Henderson's description of her twin boys' reading difficulties, nodding at appropriate intervals while acutely aware of Finn's movement through the crowd. "Miss Barkley," came his voice from beside her sometime later, "enjoying the festivities." She turned to find him standing closer than expected, a cup of punch in each hand. He offered one to her with a slight bow. "Thank you," she said, accepting the drink. "And yes, everyone has been most welcoming. Glad to hear it." He nodded to Mrs. Henderson, who excused herself with a knowing smile that made Grace want to sink through the floorboards. "You clean up nice, Mr. Westfield," she said, immediately regretting the forward comment. To her relief, he chuckled. "Don't get many occasions to wear anything but work clothes. Thought I should make an effort for the new schoolteacher." There was a teasing light in his eyes that made her heart beat a little faster. The band struck up a lively tune, and couples began moving to the cleared space in the center of the room. "Would you care to dance, Miss Barkley?" Finn asked, setting his cup aside and extending his hand. Grace hesitated. In Cedar Creek, she had grown accustomed to being a wallflower at such events, watching as other women were chosen for dances while she sat with the matrons and elderly. "I'm afraid I'm not very accomplished," she admitted. "That makes two of us," he replied with a grin. "But I promise not to step on your toes if you promise not to laugh when I forget the steps." The simple honesty of his admission, the lack of pretense or attempt to impress, decided her. She placed her hand in his. "I accept your terms, Mr. Westfield." His hand at her waist was respectful but steady as he guided her through the dance. He moved with more grace than he'd claimed, leading her confidently through the patterns. Conversation proved difficult over the music and the concentration required, but Grace found herself relaxing into the moment, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and music. When the song ended, another immediately began, this one slower. Finn raised an eyebrow in question, and Grace nodded, allowing him to draw her slightly closer as they moved to the gentler rhythm. "I meant to ask," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "how are you finding your accommodations, suitable for a lady of education?" The genuine concern in his question touched her. "More than suitable," she assured him. "The cabin is cozy and perfectly adequate for my needs." "Good," he nodded. "This town needs someone like you. Too many children growing up without proper learning. Were you one of them?" She asked, curious about his background. A shadow passed over his features. "In a manner of speaking. My mother taught me to read and figure before she passed. After that, education was whatever I could pick up along the way." He shrugged slightly. "Enough to run a ranch and keep the books, at least." "I'm sorry about your mother," Grace said softly. "Long time ago now," he replied, his expression clearing. "But I respect what you're doing here. Important work, teaching." The music ended, and Finn reluctantly released her. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Barkley." "Grace," she said impulsively. "You may call me Grace." His smile warmed his entire face. "Grace," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "And I'm Finn to my friends." "Are we friends then, Finn?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'd like to think so," he replied. "And I hope to be more than that in time." Before she could process this startling declaration, Mayor Hardwick approached, calling for attention. It was time for the official welcome and introduction of the new teacher to the community. Grace was led to the front of the room, her mind spinning with Finn's words and the implications they carried. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Grace threw herself into teaching, finding joy in the eager minds of her students. The children of Willow Springs were a diverse group, some from educated families who had followed Opportunity West, others who had never held a book before entering her classroom. She adjusted her methods to meet each child's needs, extending her days well beyond the official school hours to provide extra help where needed. True to his word, Finn Westfield began calling on her. His first visit came the Sunday after the social, when he appeared at her cabin door with a small crate of apples from his orchard and an invitation to ride out to see his ranch the following weekend. "It's proper, I assure you," he added hastily, seeing her hesitation. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, will be present, and it's only about 5 miles out of town." Grace accepted both the apples and the invitation, ignoring Martha's knowing looks when she mentioned the outing later that day. The Silver Creek Ranch, as Finn called his property, proved to be larger than Grace had imagined. A sturdy 2-story house stood surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and in the distance, rolling pastures where cattle grazed. Mrs. Abernathy, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, greeted them warmly and served a lunch that put Martha's considerable cooking skills to shame. Afterward, Finn showed Grace around the property, proudly pointing out improvements he'd made since purchasing the land 4 years earlier. "It was barely more than a shack and a few hundred acres when I started," he explained as they walked along a stream that bisected the property. "Been building it up bit by bit." "It's impressive," Grace said sincerely. "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time." He shrugged, but she could see her approval pleased him. Had a run of good luck with the cattle, and I bought when land was cheap. Now, with the railroad coming through next year, values are climbing. Do you manage all this alone? She asked, genuinely curious about his operation. Got 4 hands who work year-round, more during calving and roundup seasons, he replied, and Mrs. Abernathy keeps the house and would mother me to death if I let her. He smiled fondly at the mention of his housekeeper, but yes, the decisions and direction are mine to make. As they walked back toward the house, Finn's hand occasionally brushed against hers, not quite taking it, but making his presence felt. Grace found she didn't mind the contact. I have a confession to make, he said as they neared the house. I asked around about you after we met on the trail. Grace tensed. Had word of her failed engagements reached even here? Oh, nothing improper, he hastened to add. Just wanted to know if you were spoken for, if I'd be stepping on another man's territory by calling on you. Relief washed through her. And what did you learn? That you came west alone, that you're a respected teacher, and that you make the best apple pie in 3 territories, according to your cousin. His eyes crinkled with humor. Though I've yet to verify that last claim personally, Grace laughed, the tension leaving her shoulders. Martha exaggerates. My pie is merely adequate. I'll have to judge for myself someday, he said, his voice softening. Grace, I'd like to continue calling on you if you're amenable, get to know you better. The directness of his request caught her off guard. In her experience, courtship was often a dance of hints and veiled intentions. Finn's straightforward approach was refreshing but unsettling. I would like that, she heard herself say, but I should warn you I'm not very practiced at this sort of thing. It wasn't the whole truth, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal her history of rejections. Not yet, when this tentative connection felt so fragile. Makes 2 of us, he replied with that same disarming honesty she was coming to expect from him. Been too busy building something worth sharing to spend much time on the sharing part. The simple wisdom of his words stayed with Grace long after he returned her to town that evening. Over the following months, Finn became a regular visitor at the small cabin behind the schoolhouse. Sometimes he brought small gifts, fresh eggs from his henhouse, a book of poetry he'd found in the general store, wildflowers gathered on his ride into town. Other times he simply came to talk, to hear about her day with the children or share news of his ranch. Grace found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both excited and frightened her. She'd been hurt too many times to trust easily, yet Finn's consistent attention and genuine interest were wearing down her defenses. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the small porch of her cabin watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Finn took her hand in his. Grace, he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, I've been calling on you for nearly 4 months now. Has it been that long? She asked, though she knew precisely how long it had been. 17 weeks and 3 days, to be exact. He nodded, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. In that time, I've come to admire you greatly. Your intelligence, your dedication to the children, your kindness. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I know my own mind, and my mind and heart are set on you. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard similar declarations before from men who ultimately found her wanting. Yet something in Finn's steady gaze suggested this might be different. What are you saying, Finn? She asked, needing absolute clarity. I'm saying I love you, Grace Barkley, he replied without hesitation. And if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly with marriage as the intention. The words she'd longed to hear, yet now they filled her with as much fear as joy. Grace pulled her hand away, rising from her seat to put some distance between them. You don't know everything about me, she said, wrapping her arms around herself as the evening chill suddenly seemed more pronounced. Finn stood as well, respecting her space but clearly confused by her reaction. I know what matters. But if there's something you think I should know, I'm listening. The moment had come. If there was to be any chance for them, she could not begin with secrets between them. In Cedar Creek, where I lived before, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I was engaged. Not once, but several times. She swallowed hard. 7 times to be precise, and 7 times I was rejected before reaching the altar. She couldn't look at him as the words tumbled out. The reasons varied, or so they claimed: too bookish, too opinionated, too plain, too poor. But the result was always the same. I became something of a local spectacle, the woman no man would actually marry. A bitter laugh escaped her. I came west not just for a teaching position, but to escape the whispers and pity. When she finally gathered the courage to meet his gaze, she found not the disgust or amusement she feared, but a quiet anger that surprised her. 7 men, he said slowly, had the good sense to recognize your worth, but not the character to honor their commitment to you. Put that way, it sounded different than the narrative she'd carried in her heart for so long. I tell you this because... She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. Because if you're serious about courtship, you should know my history, and know that there may be something lacking in me that drives men away. Finn closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her hands firmly in his. Grace Barkley, the only thing lacking was in those men, not in you. A man's word should be his bond. A promise made should be a promise kept. His blue eyes blazed with conviction. I don't make promises lightly. If I say I love you, it's because I do. If I say I want to court you with marriage in mind, it's because I've already considered it thoroughly. He released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek. I can't erase what those fools did to you, but I can promise you this: when I make a vow, I keep it. That's who I am. And I'm asking you to believe that, to believe in me even if it's hard after what you've been through. Tears blurred Grace's vision. No one had ever defended her so fiercely or shifted the blame from her shoulders so completely. It was as if Finn had reached inside her chest and soothed a wound she'd carried for years. I want to believe, she whispered. I'm just afraid. Fear's natural, he said softly. But it doesn't have to decide things for us. We can take this slow at whatever pace you need. Grace looked up at this remarkable man, this cowboy who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. Yes, she said finally. Yes to courtship, Finn Westfield. And we'll see where it leads. His smile was like the sunrise, brilliant and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, reverent kiss that held both passion and restraint. When they parted, Grace felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, as if the pieces of her life were finally falling into their proper places. Winter descended on Willow Springs with a vengeance that year. Heavy snows blocked the passes, isolating the town for weeks at a time. The schoolhouse remained open, though attendance fluctuated with the weather and the ability of outlying families to make the journey into town. Finn still came to see Grace whenever conditions allowed, sometimes staying in town for days when storms made the return to his ranch impossible. During one such storm in early January, trapped in town by a blizzard that howled like a living creature, Finn proposed. They were in Martha and James's parlor, where Grace had been invited for dinner along with several other weather-stranded townspeople. As the evening wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, the guests departed for their lodgings in town, leaving only the family and Finn. While Martha and James busied themselves in the kitchen, Finn took Grace's hand and led her to the window where they watched the snow swirl in the lamplight. This weather reminds me of something my father used to say, he told her, his voice low and intimate. He said you judge a man not by how he behaves in fair weather, but by what he does in a storm. He turned to face her fully. Grace, I've known fair weather and storms in my life, and I know which I prefer to weather alone and which I'd rather face with a partner. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Maybe there is no perfect moment, just the one we choose to make meaningful. He opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. It was my mother's, he explained. She made my father promise to give it to the woman I chose to marry someday. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Finn, he dropped to one knee, holding the ring up to her. Grace Barkley, I love you. Through fair weather and storms, through good times and hard ones, I want to face life with you by my side. Will you marry me? Time seemed suspended as Grace looked down at this man, this steadfast, honorable man who had pursued her with gentle persistence, who had heard her worst fears and not turned away, who looked at her now with such hope and love that it took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Finn Westfield, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with promise and a certainty that had been building between them for months. Martha's delighted gasp from the doorway broke them apart, and suddenly there were congratulations and embraces. James producing a bottle of brandy he'd been saving for a special occasion, toasts being made to the future. Later, when the celebrations had quieted and they sat close together before the fire, Finn asked, "When would you like to be married? Spring, when the pass is clear. Summer, after the school term ends," Grace considered. After so many false starts and broken promises, part of her wanted to seize this happiness immediately, before anything could happen to take it away. Yet she also knew Finn was different, that his word was, indeed, his bond. 2 weeks, she said decisively. The last Saturday in January. Finn's eyebrows rose in surprise. "So soon, are you certain?" "Completely certain," she replied. "Unless you need more time," he laughed, drawing her closer. "Grace, I'd marry you tomorrow if the minister would agree to venture out in this blizzard. 2 weeks sounds perfect." And so it was decided. The news spread quickly through the small town, met with genuine pleasure by most. Grace had earned the community's respect through her dedication to their children, and Finn was well regarded as a fair businessman and good neighbor. Their union seemed a natural and fitting match to most observers. There were, of course, a few disappointed young women who had set their caps for the handsome rancher, and 1 or 2 men who had harbored hopes regarding the pretty schoolteacher. But such is the way of small towns, and the general mood was one of celebration. The wedding took place as planned in the town's small church, decorated with evergreen boughs and candles against the winter darkness. Grace wore a dress of deep green wool that Martha had helped her make, with a lace collar that had belonged to her mother. Finn wore a new suit ordered from the catalog and looked so handsome that Grace felt a momentary disbelief that this man was choosing her. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Finn spoke his vows in a clear, unwavering voice, Grace felt the last of her doubts melt away. This was real, this was lasting, this was love as she had always hoped it might be. A reception followed at the town hall, where it seemed every resident of Willow Springs had gathered to celebrate with food, music, and dancing that continued well into the night. When at last they slipped away, it was to return to the Silver Creek Ranch, to the home that would now be theirs together. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared the house beautifully, with fires lit in the grates and fresh linens on the bed. She had discreetly retired to her quarters in a small attached cottage, leaving the newlyweds to their privacy. Standing in the bedroom that was now theirs, Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. For all her previous engagements, she remained inexperienced in the intimate aspects of marriage. Finn seemed to sense her apprehension. "We have all the time in the world," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." His consideration only deepened her love for him. "I am ready," she assured him, "just a bit nervous." "As am I," he admitted with a small smile. "I want you to be perfect." "It already is," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Because it's you and me together." Their coming together that night was tender and awkward in turns, with moments of uncertainty followed by discoveries of surprising pleasure. Finn was patient and attentive, putting her comfort before his own desires. By the time they fell asleep in each other's arms, Grace knew that this aspect of their marriage, like all others, would only grow stronger with time and trust. The winter months passed in a haze of newfound domestic happiness. Grace continued teaching, making the daily ride into town when weather permitted, while Finn managed the ranch through the challenges of the harsh season. They established routines and rituals, morning coffee together before dawn, reading aloud to each other in the evenings, learning the 1,000 small compromises that make a marriage work. There were adjustments, of course. Grace had lived alone for years and was accustomed to her independence. Finn had his own established ways of doing things. They occasionally disagreed, sometimes vigorously, but always found their way back to common ground through honest communication and mutual respect. When spring finally arrived, melting the snows and turning the landscape a vibrant green, Grace made an important discovery. The persistent fatigue she'd been experiencing, the subtle changes in her body, they pointed to one conclusion: she was with child. She shared the news with Finn on a Sunday morning as they sat on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains. "Finn," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I believe we're going to have a child, sometime in late October by my calculations." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, his eyes filled with tears. Without a word, he knelt before her chair and pressed his face against her still flat stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "A baby," he whispered finally, looking up at her with such naked joy that Grace felt her own eyes well up. "Our baby. Oh, Grace, I never dared hope for such happiness." His reaction banished any lingering fears she might have harbored about his response. They held each other as the sun climbed higher, making plans and sharing dreams for this new life they had created together. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and summer months. Grace continued teaching until the end of the term in June, then reluctantly tendered her resignation. The school board was understanding, promising to hold her position should she wish to return after the baby's arrival. As her body changed and the child within her grew stronger, Grace found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her to this moment. The heartbreaks and humiliations that had once seemed like failures now appeared as necessary steps on her journey to Finn and the life they were building together. "You ever think about them?" Finn asked one evening as they sat on the porch, his hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "The men who broke their promises to you," Grace considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "not with regret or longing, but with a kind of gratitude. If any of them had kept their word, I wouldn't be here now with you." She covered his hand with hers. "And I wouldn't trade this life for anything," he smiled, leaning over to kiss her gently. "Their loss, my immeasurable gain." The baby came in late October, as Grace had predicted. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through a day and night of autumn storms that lashed at the windows of their bedroom. Dr. Wilson had ridden out from town, along with Martha, who stayed by Grace's side throughout the ordeal. Finn, banished to the hallway by the doctor's orders, wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing. Just as dawn broke on the second day, a new cry joined the howling of the wind, the lusty, indignant wail of their daughter entering the world. When at last Finn was allowed into the room, he found Grace pale and exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Finn," she said, her voice weak but filled with wonder, "meet your daughter." He approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid the scene might dissolve before his eyes. When Grace placed the tiny infant in his arms, he gazed down at the red, wrinkled face with an expression of such awe and tenderness that Grace felt her heart might burst with love for them both. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the wisp of dark hair that crowned the baby's head. "What shall we call her?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter's determined little face, Grace knew. "Elizabeth," she said. "After your mother, Elizabeth Hope Westfield." "Hope," Finn repeated, testing the name. "Because that's what she is, the embodiment of hope and all our dreams. And because I never lost hope that somewhere, someone would see me for who I truly am," Grace added softly, "even when it seemed impossible." Finn leaned down to kiss her, then carefully returned the baby to her arms. "I saw you from the first moment, Grace, and I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful that you saw me too." The first year of Elizabeth's life passed in a blur of joy, exhaustion, and discovery. She grew quickly, a sturdy child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. The ranch prospered under Finn's careful management. allowing them to hire additional help that freed Grace to devote herself to their daughter while still keeping her mind engaged with books and learning. On Elizabeth's first birthday, as they celebrated with a small gathering of friends including Martha and James, Finn presented Grace with a surprise plans for an addition to the house. A proper library, he explained, showing her the drawings he'd commissioned. With shelves for all your books and space for more, and eventually a place to teach Elizabeth and. He hesitated, a hopeful expression crossing his face. Perhaps other children, should we be so blessed. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she studied the plans. The thoughtfulness of the gift, this recognition of her passion for learning and her desire to share it, touched her deeply. "It's perfect," she said, embracing him tightly. "And yes, I think Elizabeth would benefit greatly from siblings, don't you?" His delighted laugh told her all she needed to know about his feelings on the matter. That night, after their guests had departed and Elizabeth slept peacefully in her crib, Finn and Grace stood on the porch of their home, his arm around her waist as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "Are you happy, Grace?" he asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "Is this the life you hoped for?" She considered the question seriously, as was her nature. The girl who had fled Cedar Creek in shame and desperation could never have imagined the fullness of the life she now lived, the love of a good man, the joy of their child, the respect of their community, the comfort of their home. Even her teaching continued, though informally, as she tutored several ranch children too far from town to attend school regularly. "It's better than anything I dared to hope for," she answered honestly. "When I left Cedar Creek, I thought perhaps I might find a quiet life, some useful work, and a measure of peace. I never imagined." She gestured to encompass their home, their sleeping child, the two of them together, all of this. Finn turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "When I met you on that muddy trail, something told me you were different, special in a way I couldn't quite name. I'm grateful every day that I listened to that voice." "As am I," Grace replied, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "Every rejection led me here to you. Every closed door pointed me toward the one that would open to this life." She smiled, thinking of Elizabeth sleeping inside and the library that would soon be built, of the years stretching before them filled with possibility. "It seems that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments. And sometimes," Finn added, drawing her closer, "a man just needs to be smart enough to recognize a treasure when he finds one." Their kiss was sweet with the familiarity of shared days and nights, yet still held the spark that had first drawn them together. Above them, a shooting star blazed briefly across the vast Montana sky, a fleeting reminder of how rare and precious their finding each other had been. Inside the sturdy house that was their home, their daughter slept soundly, secure in the knowledge, even at her tender age, that she was deeply loved. And in the hearts of Grace and Finn Westfield, gratitude mingled with joy as they embraced the life they had built together, a life neither had expected but both had ultimately found their way to, against all odds. "I love you, Finn Westfield," Grace whispered against his lips. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." "And I love you, Grace Westfield," he replied, his voice strong and sure as the day he had first proposed, "in fair weather and in storms, now and always." Hand in hand, they went inside to their daughter, to their home, to the future they would continue to build together, one day, one challenge, one joy at a time. For Grace, once rejected by every suitor, had found in this cowboy not just acceptance, but a love that completed her in ways she had never imagined possible. And in their daughter, they both had discovered a new dimension of love that expanded their hearts and cemented their bond in ways that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together. In the years that followed, the Westfield family grew. 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, Grace bore twin boys whom they named William and James. 3 years later, another daughter joined their family, called Martha after Grace's beloved cousin who had first brought her to Willow Springs. The library Finn built became the heart of their home, a place of learning not only for their children, but for others in the community who sought knowledge. Grace never returned to formal teaching at the schoolhouse, finding her calling instead in educating her own children and occasionally those of neighboring ranches who came to study with the respected Mrs. Westfield. Silver Creek Ranch prospered under Finn's careful stewardship, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. He remained the same straightforward, honorable man Grace had fallen in love with, teaching their children by example the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together in the library surrounded by books and memories, Grace would think about the long, strange journey that had brought her to this life. The rejections that had once seemed like failures now appeared as necessary detours on the path to where she was meant to be. And in those moments, with Finn's hand warm in hers and the sounds of their sleeping children drifting from the bedrooms above, Grace Westfield knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the hearts of those who loved her completely, just as she was.